Hello, good morning everyone. It feels a bit like a political rally, which in some ways is probably quite apt, because I guess a lot of today is about how we take everything that we've been doing and all the great work that you lot have been involved in, and start to think about how we protect and grow it for the future. And in some senses, that's quite a political thing to do, I think, because it's always felt a bit more like a social movement than just a new way of delivering services. So the more we can manage to get that message across to people, I think the more chance we have to succeed. What I'm here to do is to tell you a bit about the journey in Thurrock, and the way that local area coordination has been a real catalyst for change. Reflecting back on some of the things Eddie said, quite interesting to hear that perspective, because very much local area coordination has been a real driving force behind everything we've been trying to do in Thurrock over the past 6 or 7 years. In two ways, really. The first, and probably the most important way, is that behaviours change people. And I think the way that the local area coordinators in Thurrock hit the ground running and showed through what they were doing, their ability to be impactful and to genuinely change the way we thought about the people we were supporting and improve the outcomes for some people that had never been particularly well served by everything else that we'd tried to do to them over the years, really did drive a fundamental kind of mindset change amongst a whole range of other practitioners and politicians and senior managers in the adult social care department, and increasingly across the whole council and bits of health. So from that point of view, local area coordination is very much, again using Eddie's term, not a project, it is a transformation program. And the other way that it changed it was because of the philosophy that underpins it. We learned a lot in the early days about that idea of staying very true to a set of core principles about which there could be no deviation, because the integrity of the program was such that if you didn't do it in the way that the tried and trusted Western Australia model told you had to do it, then you couldn't guarantee you were going to get the same outcomes. However, again, as Eddie said, around the edges of that, there was lots of room for flexibility and for the uniqueness of the local situation to change the way that local area coordination was delivered in certain key areas, but always holding very, very true to the integrity of those core principles. And the other thing it taught us was the advantage of starting small and proving the concept and growing it afterwards. The idea of any kind of big bang in any sort of transformation, I think, is flawed and very rarely works. And early on, there was talk of local area coordination becoming a national program managed by the Department of Health, and thank God that idea went out the window, because that definitely would have killed it. So this is about local and about small and about proving the point, and then growing the service. So talking to colleagues from Birmingham, from Haringey, although you started very small, in fact in the Birmingham case it's almost a kind of microcosm of what you would need for it to be successful across the whole of Birmingham. But there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's done as a sort of test and learn, and with a desire to expand once you've proved it. So moving swiftly on, our first transformation program began in about 2012-13. And was based on a piece of research that we did across South Essex that featured 3 distinct areas. The first, the most obvious, being the need to integrate services far more around the individual. Lots of stories came back about people who were having to tell their story hundreds of times to bunch of different people over and over again, and then when they received services, they received it in bits and pieces from a variety of different professionals. In some cases, as many as 20 or 30 different individuals coming in and out of their lives on a regular basis, which is clearly not conducive to building a trusting relationship, and also very difficult for the people who are at the centre of that kind of professional structure. The second thing was the importance of the built environment and the need to influence far more the houses that we built, not only specialist housing, but also general regeneration stuff, working with developers differently, making sure that in an area like Thurrock, where there's 30-odd thousand new houses due to go up in the next 30 years, the impact on health and social care and on building community was an integral part of that development and was taken seriously by the development organisations that were involved. And the third, and perhaps most surprising, was the very strong message we got back that actually communities were really important, and working with communities to build their resilience and to allow them to be places that supported well-being and were connected was absolutely vital to any chance we had of creating a sustainable system for the future. That was a surprise, because I think, like most people, we'd kind of seen that as the business of the third sector, of CVS, of a community development team within the council, very much a separate thing. But what came back very loud and very clear was, actually, if you're going to get well-being right, you've got to begin with community, and you've got to begin with how well those communities are structured and resilient enough to be able to support people. That led us down the route of asset-based community development. We had Cormac Russell over, who spoke to us about that philosophical approach to community development, which was amazingly well received and made a lot of sense. And then we started talking to Ralph and Inclusive Neighbourhoods about local area coordination. So those two planks were very much part of our initial transformation journey, something called Building Positive Futures. And as Eddie has said, it was a 5-year programme. After about 3 years, we looked at it, we reviewed what had worked well, what hadn't, we changed things around, and then we started thinking about the next 5 years, because whilst we'd been doing what we were doing, the world had changed fairly dramatically. Austerity had really started to kick in. We had massive problems with our domiciliary care service. Our residential care services were under a lot of pressure. And generally speaking, there was a whole lot of new challenges that we had to begin to think about. The reason why local area coordination was so important to all of those questions, because in Thurrock we start from a kind of blank page always. We don't try and tinker around with the edges of what's not working. We try and rethink it from almost scratch, and very much with service users and others in mind in terms of co-design and co-production principles. And what was very, very clear to us was some of those things we'd learned as a result of having local area coordination as core principles were going to be really important in our attempt to try and reimagine what our service offer would look like in the future. And these are the kind of things that we started to develop as a series of kind of maxims around what would inform all of our transformation going forward. Important in two ways, because it meant when we sat down to try and work out with others what the future landscape might look like, we had these at the heart of it. But also important because we came across some other fantastic people who were doing really interesting things out there, and who we could hold a mirror up to and say, actually, what they're doing is very much in keeping with our view of the world. Wouldn't it be good to partner with them? And wouldn't it be good to use them to help us to develop services? Probably the best example of that being Community Catalysts, who very early on we realised we were speaking a common language, and we were fortunate enough to get them involved in our transformation work, and they proved absolutely invaluable. So this was the mantra that Cormac used and was, again, running through everything that we did. It sounds trite, it sounds trivial. but it's truly, truly transformative in terms of the traditional way that we had been delivering services for so long that had inadvertently disempowered so many of the people we were trying to support. Very paternalistic, very much based on just how bad is your life. Tell us it's really, really bad, and then we'll be able to give you a service. If it's not quite bad enough, we can't quite do that yet, but we will come back to you when you're really desperate, and it's actually far too late to give you anything much more than just some support to endure your misery with slightly less suffering. To an approach that said, actually, we'll talk to everybody, and we'll talk to them about what their version of a good life looks like. And wherever possible, we'll try and be a lot more flexible around eligibility, which at a time of austerity was really difficult, but we thought we can't keep just shutting the door on people because they aren't quite bad enough yet. We've got to do something more proactive. And actually having a conversation rather than doing a needs assessment changes everything, and allows you to begin to build a far more trusting, far more positive, far more genuinely collaborative approach to the way that we offer support to people based on their view of the world, based on the things that they care most about, rather than them having to prove to us just how bad their life was. So these are some of the things that fell out of that growing realization that everything we did, we had to do through the prism of place and through the prism of communities, and based on those same core principles that we just touched upon. We had a growing community hubs program that early on we decided would be within the kind of managerial ownership of the communities themselves. So these are not small councils in the community. These are genuine community hubs that we use in the same way as other organisations use, but are seen as being a community asset and very much owned by the communities themselves. And are flourishing. I think we've got 6 now with 2 more in the pipeline, which probably leaves around 3 or 4 areas of Thurrock that haven't yet got a community hub. But again, the principle being it was based on them coming forward, telling us they wanted one, and us supporting them in making that happen. There's not a blueprint. One of them's in a hall, another one's in an ex-library. In fact, 2 are in libraries. It's more about the idea and the concept than the building, and has been successful. We have social prescribing, started via health. I'll share some of Sean's slight cynicism about it, but it's there and we're working with it. It's run by our CVS. And actually, because we made the effort to make sure that we could work alongside it in terms of all the other things we're doing in the community, it's worked reasonably well for us. Social prescribers very much seeing LACs as an asset that they use, that they refer to regularly, and the relationship works fairly well. We have Small Sparks, which is a small amount of money that can be bid for from anyone that has an idea that they can share with us, they think will be a benefit to their community. They can bid for up to 250 quid. It gets them a start often, no more than that. But it's a fairly open process. You don't have to jump through a million hoops to get the money. And it's been a really important source of seed funding for some really interesting community ideas that have sprung up. I'm looking up there, I can look down here, sorry. Micro enterprise, very much through our partnership with Community Catalysts. We had a slightly different approach, I think, than some other areas. We seconded a member of our own staff to be the manager of the community, of the micro enterprise development scheme. She was so successful that after 18 months we made it a permanent post. It's now a post that sits within our commissioning team and also works very closely with our local area coordination team. We've gone from none or very, very few small local enterprises to over 100 now. And the stories of some of the achievements through allowing and stimulating that sort of natural development of local people who want to put something back and want to do it either in a voluntary or a paid form through developing a small micro enterprise have been astonishing. We have a very active and very well supported time bank. This is for those who don't know, perhaps you all do, but just in case, this is a system where you can exchange time with other people by sharing your gifts or your abilities to do something for someone else. You can bank the time that you've provided for somebody and get that back if you choose to from someone else on the time bank register, or indeed you can give that time into a bank, and that bank is then used to stimulate volunteering in areas. And we have a local giving service and local area coordination. So when we sat down and said, okay, what's worked, what hasn't, what we're going to do for the next 5 years, one of the things that were absolutely key to that second phase of transformation was a need to get health far more closely embedded in the work we'd done. Most of what we'd done had been as an adult social care department. We'd had some success in getting some health providers involved, particularly our local community provider. And we'd had a limited success getting the rest of the council involved as well. But we hadn't really delivered a whole systems transformation, which was what our ambition had always been. So collectively, between us and the CCG, we launched the second phase of transformation called Better Care Together Thurrock. And it involved a number of different things. We more and more started to realise the power of working with community in a place-based way, of seeing the world as a series of much smaller kind of organisational footprints within which we would need to develop a different response often because of the very different nature of the areas we were working with. And we found that by moving our focus of attention down to much smaller units, by really understanding those communities, by working out what the assets were, by working out what went well, by talking to communities about what they cared enough about to want to change, we could develop a very different form of strategic transformation. Yes, there are some things that need to be done at high level. Yes, there are some things that need to be done at local authority level. But increasingly, more and more of our organisation and our service delivery was being fashioned at a place level, something between a few neighbourhoods up to and including the kind of local area coordination footprint of 10 or 12,000 people. Okay, and as a result of that kind of strategic thinking, that kind of planning, we introduced a number of things. The first, again, working with a fantastic organisation, National Development Team for Inclusion, we introduced a social work model called community-led support, which fundamentally takes social workers out of the civic offices, gets them to work in very similar ways to local area coordinators in terms of the geography. They're based in the community. We told them to go out and to have permission to do things in exactly the way that they wanted to do them, apart from the two boundaries that we set around them, which was don't break the bank and don't break the law. Apart from that, go out and do what you see fit. As a result of that, the assessment form that they were using prior to that went from something like 20 pages down to a single sheet of paper often. They set up a number of talking shops in the community where people could just drop in and talk to social workers about their particular issue. It might have been a family member, it might have been way before they would have normally contacted us. It could have been about an existing case. But very quickly it became almost the norm to have that conversation with people in a public space in the community. Obviously, protected, so people's personal business couldn't be overheard, but very much dropping in and having a conversation. We went from, as most other social work teams, 100% of assessments being done in someone's own home. When you stop and think about it, what a balmy idea that is. I mean, you don't get a GP come round to everybody every time you want to go and see one, or any other professional, but somehow we'd started up this normative behaviour for social workers having to deliver assessments within someone's own home. It's necessary sometimes, and we still do deliver assessments in people's own homes, but increasingly a lot more of that work is done in a community space as a result of a conversation, rather than this very formal, very costly approach of making sure that we arranged to visit you. We tried to rethink how we would deliver support around people in their own home in future, purposefully not using the term domiciliary care or home care, because we thought it was a kind of idea past its sell-by date. We started to look at Birdsong models of neighbourhood teams who were self-managed, and we started to develop our own system of neighbourhood teams that would be self-managed. Then we came across Helen Sanderson Associates, who'd already done some work in a very similar fashion, using again Birdsong as a sort of template. And we partnered with her, and we introduced 2 wellbeing teams into one of the areas of Thurrock about 7 months ago. It's not quite the Helen Sanderson wellbeing team model. We changed things around a little bit because we thought that there was some things that we could improve on. So these are managed by the council. The staff are employed by the council. They're not employed by Helen. But we use very much some of the systems and organisational principles that she developed. I have to tell you that moving to self-management is incredibly, incredibly difficult. It sets up all sorts of challenges for both the hierarchies that are in existence and also for the people themselves who have been very used to working in an environment of kind of being told what to do. But we gave permission again, we trusted people completely, and we wanted them to develop an approach that was based on self-management. Self-management isn't anarchy, by the way. Someone was talking the other day, and one of the team said, so, what exactly do you mean? And a colleague used this description. I think it probably is about as good as I've heard. He said, it's not about having no hierarchy, it's about getting rid of all the unnecessary hierarchy that all of you will come across in your working lives. And he's absolutely right. So this is about stripping out unnecessary layers of management oversight that in effect disempowers people from using their creativity and their energy. So it's about empowering people to take far more responsibility. And you will find, as Birdsong have found, that actually once people get comfortable in that environment, their productivity goes up, there's far less sickness, people's satisfaction levels at work and morale go up, because everybody ultimately, or most people ultimately, like the idea that they can be in control of their own destiny to a degree and use their creativity and be supported to do so. Very much based on trust, very much based on a distributed model of leadership. After 7 months, we had an appraisal. Found that one of the teams had adopted self-management really, really well. They'd worked out how to work together collegiately. There was an awful lot of give and take. People were starting to support one another. If somebody needed some time, someone else would step in and take their shift for them. The other team was a complete disaster. It would completely loggerheads. Nobody was prepared to help anyone else out. It was self-management was seen almost as a credo for do what I like. And it is a really, really difficult thing to make work, but the potential for it is enormous. So we are sticking to it, and we're going to keep going. The Birdsong model in West Suffolk, I found out the evaluation of that has now come out. They were working on 18 months. And they were working with nurses, not with carers. And they found that self-management was an almost impossible nut to crack. Their feeling is within the NHS, because it's so used to command and control, it can probably never happen. I personally think that that's a shame, and I think they should have stuck with it for longer. But it's an example of how difficult this stuff is. But as I've said, the potential is enormous, and we will make it happen. A much bigger push on technology. So we started to see technology as broadly as we all see it in our lives now, not just about telehealth and telecare. So we freed up some money. We said we were going to give people permission up to a certain financial envelope to be able to do an assessment. We trained them to do an assessment so they could order and provide bits of kit free of charge to people where they could make a case that it was going to be a preventative act. Again, not reams and reams of paperwork and bureaucracy, very simple form that said, I've suggested this person gets an Alexa because this is happening in their lives, and if we don't do something, I have a strong feeling that they'll require a more expensive service within the next 12 months, whatever. And we're free to order and put it in place, and we are evaluating that constantly. And the early evidence seems to be that actually providing technology in that really creative way as an act of prevention does have tremendous potential in terms of prevent, avoid, delay to use the Care Act. Particular case in point is something called Brain in Hand. Don't know if any of you have used it, but it's a palm-held device that supports people with learning disabilities and with mental health issues who lack confidence to go and travel independently, go and live their lives independently. This is a kind of aid memoir that has some fairly low-level responses. So if you're waiting for a bus and it's 10 minutes late, it might come up and say, don't worry, the bus will be along in a minute, you haven't got to panic. Up to and including, you can actually trigger a kind of panic button and you can get some direct support. It's 750 quid a year for a licence, and I have to say, the evidence from that is truly astonishing in terms of making some really quite previously dependent people much, much more independent because of the confidence it has given them to travel and go about their business on their own. We again came across something in mental health services. That's a Finnish model called Open Dialogue. They actually approached us because they thought it was very similar to local area coordination. It's very much based on the conversation model. It's very much based on putting the person with the mental health issue at the heart of everything that is done, at the heart of planning, at the heart of any decision that's taken around their future support or medication. It's been in Finland for about 30 years, and they have transformed their mental health services from probably the worst in the Western world in terms of rates of suicide, in terms of rates of people in acute settings and medication levels, to the best in the Western world. The impact has been truly amazing. We're starting to be part of a national pilot with that, again, very much in keeping with the direction of travel that we have. Multi-skilled primary care teams, and improvement, identification, management of long-term conditions, work that came out of our Director of Public Health, who looked at the fact that Thurrock is one of the most under-doctored areas in the country. What could we do about that? So we have developed a much broader, multi-skilled workforce in primary care. That means you can now get an appointment if you ring up. Instead of waiting 3 weeks, in most cases within 24, 48 hours, because most often people ring up don't require to see a GP. They require some different form of intervention, and by having that multi-skilled workforce, we can now have them seen by another practitioner. Finally, management of long-term conditions is around the fact that the way that the National Health Service reward GPs for people with long-term conditions on their caseloads had a cut-off point, which meant they only had to identify, I think it was 80% of people with long-term conditions, and they only had to treat the same amount of people. So we gave them a little bit of extra money so that they had to identify 100% of people with long-term conditions living in their patch, and we would provide support through community intervention. As most of you will probably know, managing multiple long-term conditions is one of the biggest single factors behind people ending up hitting your door in need, and often in quite high level of need through something like a stroke or a fall. So by managing that far better in the community, and stopping people going into crisis, going into hospital, has a massive impact on the system. That's what it's all about, as Eddie said earlier. I'm rushing through because I'm probably running out of time. Okay, so describing what we were doing in a single graphic, we came across this from the Harvard Business School. It fitted our purpose perfectly. The ecosystem idea was a very enchanting idea because the way communities are very like other ecosystems. They are a symbiotic relationship of interconnectedness. And if you want to go in and to help them to become sustainable, a bit like if you go into a rainforest, you have to be amazingly sensitive to that system. If you go steaming in and start cutting down trees and all the other stuff that we did for years in ecosystems, you upset that delicate balance and you end up doing more harm than good. So it was a really good metaphor for us in terms of the way we wanted to support individuals, but also the way we wanted to support communities. And the other metaphor for me with this is we've all become very, very aware of the problem of waste in our communities or in our society. We're all into kind of recycling and caring about the planet, blah, blah, blah. And yet one of the biggest single wastes within each of those communities was the human waste of us disempowering people, forgetting to identify their gifts, forgetting to identify their strengths and their passions, and allowing them to use those in a productive way because of our very paternalistic way of supporting people. So I think this really works well for me because our endeavour is about recycling those human talents and making them much more of a positive force within their communities rather than disempowering them, marginalising them, and kind of seeing them as the worst form of human waste. And finally, this was just something that occurred to me recently, and I walked in yesterday to yet another conversation about proving the cost effectiveness of local area coordination. And I thought about how circular this whole endeavour is. So the story begins with a bunch of people sitting, stroking their beards, in an office somewhere going, what are we going to do about this? Doing nothing isn't an option, is it? And they go, no, it's not an option. We must do something. We've really got to change it because it's all coming apart and, God, what are we going to do? And then someone comes up with a bright idea and go, that's it, we'll do that, but we'll pilot it and we'll evaluate it. And they do that, and after about a year, they go, right, so where's the evidence for this being, cost effective? Where's the evidence that this is exactly what we want it to do because it's going to achieve all those things? And they go, it's not really there, is it? Can't really see it. There's a lot of really good stories about the impact it's having on people, but, where's the data? So they go, that's it, we'll scrap it. And then they go back, and then they go back into that room, and they start saying, but doing nothing isn't an option, is it? Because, it's all broken, so what should we do? And so it goes on. And the thing is, we never stop and evaluate the stuff that's broken. No one has ever sat down and said, is having social work cost effective? Are hospitals good things to have? And how about, mental health services that have to go through GPs? I'm sure if we put the same focus on the existing things that we know are not necessarily working, and I'm not saying social work doesn't, I'm just saying the system as a whole, we would find it is almost impossible to prove a cost-benefit case for any of them. And yet we're far happier staying with those things that we know are not delivering the kind of quality services we want than we are taking a bit of a risk on something new where the evidence might not quite be there yet. But if we hold our nerve and we keep going because we know in human terms they're having a massive impact, eventually they will become the norm. And that is my hope for local area coordination, because I think it is one of the absolute planks upon which any future health and social care system has to be built. Thank you.